So this afternoon we have date to decisions, benchmarking, agronomy. So we have Brunel Sabourin here, and Brunel is the owner of Antara Agronomy Services Limited, and has been a trusted advisor to growers for almost 30 years. Growing up on a farm in the Red River Valley, Brunel developed a deep passion for agriculture and brings a wealth of practical, hands-on experience to his consulting work. Since the introduction of herbicide-tolerant canola varieties, he has been at the forefront of advancements in canola production, helping farmers increase their strategies and maximize yields. Brunel, welcome.
Welcome, thank you. I think that was possibly the introduction for my canola panel on Monday morning. Welcome everybody, my name is Brunel Sabourin. As she mentioned, I'm an owner, an agronomist by trade, owner and operator of Antara Agronomy Services. We're a consulting company based out of St. Jean, Manitoba. Just to give a little bit of background of how I got to be on this stage today. Antara Agronomy is about 10 years ago I found a need and a void in the industry, and where we are collectively, we're in the bottom of a floodplain. And I wanted to find better answers for my growers to local production challenges. So I had worked a bunch as a retail agronomist, as an independent agronomist. I've been in this game probably about 30 years, but 10 years ago I decided to venture out on my own. So right off the hop, when I started my consulting company, we established a research company doing on-farm research. We saw the need, and that's what our focus was on. So finding better answers for our growers and always finding a better way of doing things. So from there, the Antara research, that led to the development of the Antara On-Farm Research Network. This was a group of growers that were all interested in doing on-farm research. So we decided to form a group as a peer group, and our pitch to them and to the growers, their value is we offered them, if they would agree to host 2 on-farm trials in a year, we would collect all of the data together and then present them back the results. So we had a group of we hover between 15 and 20 people in the growers in this group. So it's allowed us to return back. A farmer would host 2 trials, but he'd get the results back from 30 to 40. And all of these trials are all held within about a 20-25 mile radius of St. Jean, just so that we can do better or give better comparisons between apples to apples, because there's a lot of variability in growing crops and growing environments, once you're outside of the valley or even in another province. So it was the need for local data. From there, we decided we wanted to do even more to collect data. So we started an agronomy benchmarking group, and that's the Antara Insights. We're going to be talking a lot about that this afternoon. And then after that, to get even more data, we saw a need for more precise weather data. So that's where we started the Antara Weather Network this past year. And I would not be here today if it wasn't for somebody else. This is my wife, Jennifer. She's the other side of Antara Agronomy. Funny story, when she decided to come onto the company, she was teaching in the public education system at the time, and they were asking her to go from teaching grades 5, 6 down to grades 1, 2. And before she made that decision, she had decided to come with me it was a Saturday morning, beautiful day outside. The sun was shining, and end of May, nice breeze, and we went weed scouting. So I drove out into a field, and we're sitting in the side-by-side, just driving along, counting or looking at weeds, counting plants. And I could feel something from the passenger seat, a glare. So I kind of looked up, and Jen looks at me and she says, "Are you effing serious? Pardon my French. Is this what you do all day?" No parents screaming at you, no kids running around, no crying, no this, no that. So it wasn't long after that she made the decision to jump. Our research program had been expanding, and Jen had done a lot of research work in her animal science and in her master's degree, and she had done a bunch of teaching. So it was a really nice fit role for her to join the company and take over that role as a research manager. So part of the things that we're going to talk today is how do we use data to make better decisions? This is from the Canola Council of Canada. And I don't know if you guys know or realize, but there's over 40 different factors that can affect yield, and these factors are all intertwined. Some of them are very easy to manage, that we have a lot of influence on. That's the green category that we have over here. So these are all crop husbandry. So everything from what we're putting on for fertilizer, seeding depth, seeding speed, et cetera, et cetera. The middle category is harder to influence. A lot of these are soil related. And then the last category is all the weather related stuff. And that's what introduces a lot of big variables into growing a crop. This is what causes us to lose sleep at night sometimes, and it can make things a challenge because it has an impact on everything that we do. And it's had an impact probably for 5,000 to 10,000 years since our soils have been forming. We're in a floodplain in the Red River Valley. That's when the waters of Lake Agassiz started receding. It affects most of the area of Manitoba. But a lot of these factors here have been influencing our soil development over years and years and years and years. We've only been farming for 100 years or so, maybe 150 in the Red River Valley. And that too has introduced a lot of variability in affected soils. If we think about soil erosion, there's a lot of different things that we do that have a negative effect that can all impact what we get at the end of the day. So if we were just to run through a bit of an exercise, say we had a rain event in the spring, because of the topography on the field, now we had localized flooding, and that's going to affect our seeding date, but because of the latitude or longitude where our fields are, now we have a problem with frost-free days and potentially the crop not making it. Conversely, if we made a decision to do zero-till, that leaves more crop residue on the field, which traps more snow. We have heavy clay soils, so now we might have a soil drainage issue where the water won't leave the fields and the residue traps that moisture in. It doesn't allow it to evaporate. It causes a drop in soil temperatures, reduces our evaporation. Now we have a problem. We don't have enough oxygen in the soils to get good rooting depth, which then affects fertilizer uptake. So you can see these things are all intertwined, all working together. And I compare it a bit to a game of Jenga, but maybe I should call it a game of Connect 4 or Connect 40. I'm sure if we spent enough time and had a couple of beers, we could find a way to connect all of these things into one long storyline. But because there are all of these variables, now that makes it really tough to make agronomic decisions during the season. It means that there's a lot of right answers and also a lot of wrong answers. Just out of curiosity, how many people in the crowd are farmers? How many agronomists? Okay, so maybe a 2-to-1 difference. So what's the favorite answer as an agronomist to most of the farmer agronomy related question? It depends. It's a pet peeve of mine, and it's not what the farmers pay us the big bucks to do, is to answer it depends. So the key takeaway, what I want to do today is I want to give everybody some tools in their toolbox. It doesn't matter if you're a farmer or an agronomist. I want you guys to walk away with some ideas and some tools and a framework that you can use to help start figuring out some of these problems for your own growers or on your own farm. We're going to talk about a little bit more at length about the problem that we have and why it's a problem, but then we'll also start diving into some solutions after that. So this is a term that I've coined in the shop, agronomisery. It's a play on words between agronomy and misery. So I define it as a state of feeling of great distress or discomfort of mind or body when trying to make agronomy-related decisions during the growing season. So when you think about that, how many farmers have lost sleep over indecision? It's a big source of stress. You might be seeing your neighbor spraying and wondering, should I be as well? You might be wondering, okay, is it or isn't it going to rain? Does my crop even warrant spraying? Did I put on enough fertilizer? Is my crop even going to make it? These are all questions that keep farmers and agronomists up at night. And it's not all agronomic. It is also economic. So, our price is going to be going up or down. In the last number of years, it seems like in the farming game, we've moved from the $25 blackjack table to the $100 blackjack table. Higher prices for commodities, higher prices for inputs, that all means that we're making bigger decisions. We're playing with bigger piles of money, and any decision that we make has that much more significance to whether or not we're successful. So again, this makes for very stressful emotional decisions, and when emotion goes up, intellect tends to go down. So it's what a lot of people in business refer to as the dumb tax. So just to touch on a few things, there are 7 major factors that influence yield in the field. First one being weather. Now, so I hear a lot of times from growers when I ask them about their agronomy practices, it's, they have that feeling that it doesn't matter what we do because the weather dictates what we're going to get. To that, I like to ask the question, are you still farming the same way you were 100 years ago, even 50 or 25 years ago? But it's a real challenge. A lot of Mother Nature has the power to make us look really stupid or really smart. Often it's a roll of the dice, it's a gamble. Sometimes there's real consequences to our decisions. What if it doesn't rain after seeding? So in this video here, you can see there's some serious sidewall compaction. This was a case, floodwaters had receding, we were getting into June. Farmer really wanted to get his corn in the ground, so he made the decision to go, but the soil might not have been fit. And then, we caused some compaction, and then it didn't rain, so it dried up, and now we've got that problem. So it's not just that the roots can't push through there, the water and the nutrients can't move through there either. But it's not always the case. There are other times where we do make the right decision, or we do have the right scenarios. And Real Tatro, the owner of Emerson Milling, once told my dad, he says, we're all going to be good farmers this year. We got the right rain in the right place at the right time. The next big factor, and especially for us in the Red River Valley, in Manitoba, being as far north as we are, is getting that crop off to a really good start. So because of our short growing seasons, it's very important that we get the crop off to the best start possible. And I'll use an example of wheat. Wheat plants will set their yield. They'll decide how many heads they're going to make or how many tillers, how big of a head, how many spikelets, and how many seeds, all by the time the wheat hits that 6-leaf stage, so before it kind of starts stretching out. So that's when our maximum yield potential is set. Whatever happens after that, or whatever we try to influence after that, we're just trying to maintain that yield potential. We're trying to limit the loss of yield that might come from adverse weather or running out of fertilizer or any kind of pest pressures that we may have. Like without a great start, we're behind the 8 ball right off the go, and it's very hard to make up ground. There's an agronomist from Kentucky called Phil Needham. He's written the Bible on growing winter wheat, and he's coined the term well sown equals half grown. So half the battle is won at seeding or just before seeding, or whatever you do to the point where you get that crop in the ground. Another thing that people might struggle with is nutrition. Excuse me. What is the right amount of fertilizer and what is the right placement? What is the risk of environmental loss? How do we make sure we have enough fertilizer available when the crop needs it? Fertilizer this year is one of the most expensive fertilizers that we've had in comparison to crop or grain prices. Darren Bond has done a couple of presentations all this winter, and he says it's one of the most expensive fertilizer has been in relation to the price of the grain. It takes X number of bushels to pay for the fertilizer, so it's crucial that we are able to put on as much as we need to maximize our yield potential, but without going overboard and incurring extra unnecessary expenses. Weed pressure is fast becoming a big problem and concern for our growers, for sure in the Red River Valley. The last couple of years, we've inherited tall water hemp from our neighbors down to the south, and it's spreading like wildfire. We're starting to see it all over the place. It came in with the flood. At first, we were just seeing it on the outskirts of the flood, but it's spread. It's not hard to find anymore. This is a problem because when I speak about change and how we're always changing and always having to adapt, this is one problem that is basically doubling, if not tripling, our herbicide bills for our growers. And then the problem with that is, right now, okay, we have all of these other options that we can use. They're more expensive, sure. But every time we're spraying for a pest, we're selecting for resistance, which means that every time we use these products, they become less and less effective on the crop. Eventually, they're not making any new herbicides, so eventually applying more chem isn't going to solve our problem. It's not moving in the right direction. It's not what our end users are asking us to do. Once we don't have any chem that we can spray, that is going to start limiting our cropping options, whether it's specialty oil canolas or non-GMO soybeans, sunflowers. These are all crops that have very few options in weed control. So these are all factors that we have to consider in order to be able to keep farming. I like to ask a lot of our guys, what do you think is the cost of, or if you think the cost of good agronomy is expensive, have you ever considered the cost of poor agronomy? These are 2 farms, 2 fields of soybeans. This is an oxbow on the Red River. So every time it floods, the water runs through here. This farmer has a huge salad, and water hemp aside, just when you consider a lot of these plants are growing 1 million seeds per plant, or 200, 500,000, whatever it is, that is a huge seed bank that you've got on your field, but not only your field, it becomes the neighbor's problem if it's not taken care of. So you don't want to be that guy that is responsible for spreading this everywhere. And this is a problem that is going to haunt this land and possibly even this one for a very long time. I mentioned selection pressure. It's the same thing for diseases and even insects. Disease is one that can be tough to make a decision because it's dependent on what the weather was leading up to the right timing for the fungicide application, and also what is the weather going to do after. So we need to take all of these factors into consideration. The last couple of years with drier conditions at the time of fungicides have made it a real challenge to figure out, should we or shouldn't we be applying a fungicide. Insects, I mentioned the same thing. In the US, soybean aphids are widely known to be resistant to pyrethroids. Basically what happened there is farmers realized that they were getting a small yield bump by just throwing a cheap $1 or $2 insecticide in the tank. They were getting a return on it. It was maybe, even if it was a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1, okay, they were making $3 or $4 an acre. But what happened is they selected for resistance, and now they can't use these cheap products anymore to control their soybean aphids. So the more we use these products, the quicker we won't have them they won't be effective enough that we have that tool in the toolbox. So we need to be managing these and considering these in our decision making all the time. So when do we need good agronomy the most? Is it in a good year or in a bad year? It's a question I get asked a lot of the time, especially in a bad year when the margins are tight. Farmers are saying, I don't have the money, I need to cut somewhere. Oftentimes it's consulting expenses, but we would argue that you need good agronomy every year. It doesn't matter if it's a good or a bad year, it's always about profitability. This profitability equation, I don't know if anybody here has heard about the 5% rule. Christian Hebert, who's going to be on the stage later this afternoon, is a big preacher of this. Essentially what it is if you can get 5% better price, 5% better yield, and reduce your expenses by 5%, usually your profitability is going to double. When I came home from university, my dad told me the same thing that his dad told him, was put away your books, now your real education starts. This was a This was a presentation that Don Flayton gave probably 15, 20 years ago, and it was, how do you grow 70 bushel canola? With all of the products that we can add to the tank, it's easy, 2 bushels, 3 bushels, 6 bushels, You do the math, it's very easy to get to 70 bushels. We were going to make a video of this. I have 4 daughters at home, and some of them are onto social media, and there was a trend at the time called girl math, so we were going to do a farm girl math video where my daughter came home from university and was telling me I was doing it all wrong. If only it was that easy. The next biggest challenge is people only tend to change when the pain of change is greater than the pain of staying the same. So people will change when the pain of change, when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change. I mentioned herbicide resistance, and new crop diseases like canola and verticillium stripe seems to be a problem wide across the province this year. Well, these are problems now that are forcing us to make changes. We've always done it this way is one of the most dangerous ideologies in business. So it's always a good question that I ask my clients and farmers, and they should be asking themselves all the time too, is why do we do things the way we do them? Change is inevitable. There is always a better way. Something my dad has always said is we'll probably see more change in agriculture in the next 10 years than we've seen in the last 100. This says a lot considering 100 years ago we were switching from horses to the mechanization into engines and tractors. When I look at my career in the last 25, 30 years, I've seen the introduction of herbicide-tolerant crops. I've seen the introduction and the widespread use of fungicides, GPS guidance, and even variable rate. These are all big changes that, that 25 years is a very short span of time. When emotion goes up, intelligence goes down. So how do we avoid making all of these decisions or bad decisions? The answer is we need better data. And with better data, we need to, if we don't measure it, we can't manage it. So what is benchmarking? Benchmarking is learning the best ideas of others in essence. So it's something that's been really synonymous with big data. You're measuring the performance of your business against other peers. You're comparing actual numbers to uncover trends and best management practices. This takes out the coffee shop talk. These are actually real numbers. When you consider what big data is, it's all the data that we're collecting with farm equipment. What is that data worth? Maybe I should have phrased this, what is good quality farm data worth? When you consider everything that is being recorded by farm equipment, we know fertilizer practices, fertilizer rates, herbicides, rates, timings, yields, what kind of equipment you're using, how much fuel you're using. Somebody could paint a pretty good picture of what kind of a year a farm is having with all this data. But one of the big problems is collecting quality farm data. There's a lot of variability induced by the weather, and there's also a lot of issues with the technology. We're all running multiple pieces of equipment. Sometimes different colors don't talk to each other. There's a lot going on with farm data. When it was first introduced, everybody had the idea they were going to revolutionize agriculture with big data. They were going to take your poorest acres and make them some of your best. But then what they quickly ran up against, you look at all the venture capital money that got thrown into big data and precision ag and all that, and what they ran up against is it's very hard to collect quality data on the farm and then making it applicable across wide geographies. So when it comes to big data, typically we're talking big data. It's not a new concept. It's something that works very well in a closed environment. And what I mean by a closed environment, think a dairy barn or a hog barn or even a Walmart or a restaurant where you can control everything in that environment. It's not so easy when it comes to growing crops. You can't compare, it's hard to compare a farm in the bottom of the valley in the Red River to up the escarpment or even on the other side of the province. So the weather plays such a big variable, and I mentioned screens and sensors don't always work. So what I want to do today is just talk about how we can take big data and work it back down to a simpler way. So big data tends to be more of a regional level, but what we're going to talk about today is small data before big data, looking at things from a farm level and also down to a field level. How am I doing for time? Okay. So when I get down to talking about data and collecting better data with my growers, I like to ask 3 questions. And I encourage everybody here, whether you're an agronomist or farmer, to be asking the same 3 questions. It's how good are we? How good can we be? And how do we get there? So we're going to start off today. We're going to talk about, how can we measure how good we are, and then address the questions of how good could we be, and close up with how do we get there. So how good are we? Let's start with the basics. How many people, or how many of the farmers here soil test? Okay, good show of hands. How many soil test every field every year? Okay, about half. Not bad. We like to encourage and promote, or I'm a strong advocate to measuring soil tests, taking soil tests every year on every field. Part of the reason for that is usually there's three different things. Number one, it helps us identify erroneous results. So something like phosphate here, this is 10 years worth of soil tests. These are Olsen tests. You can see there's quite a range. This is a nutrient that really doesn't change much. It doesn't move in the soil, so there should be more consistency to it. But this allows us to track them over time, right? Like what we're seeing here is, okay, there are some odd years, so for these years, there's a lot that can potentially influence a soil test. It could be the time of year, it could be whether the field was cultivated or not cultivated. It could be a bit of the stubble if we're having trouble capturing a good 0 to 6. What we find in the valley is when dry soils, that top inch or two turns to powder, it tends to trickle down the tube. So in dry years, we might be sending a 1 to 7 or a 2 to 8 sample to the lab where we think it's 0 to 6, but most of the fertilizers in that top 3-4 inches, so we tend to come back with these lower levels on those particular years. So if I was an agronomist doing a recommendation and a farmer gave me a soil test that had 3 parts per million of phosphate, I'd be in panic mode. Like, that's super low levels. Normally, I would say we should retest that field just to make sure, but in this particular case, because we've got a track record, we've got 10 years of soil samples that we're looking at, we know that our average is 8 or possibly even higher, but at least we're hovering above that 6-7 parts per million range. And I should maybe, just to put things into context, our soil pHs are very high, and it tends to buffer the amount of available phosphorus that shows up on a soil test. If I have fields that had a pH of 7.5, generally my available phosphate would double. It's not that the phosphate isn't there, it's just that's what's showing up on the soil test as an estimate of what will be available next year. But anyways, with all that aside, we look at this and we look, okay, our phosphate levels seem to be trending in the wrong direction. They're going down. You know, we've got maybe not as bad with the potassium, but the same thing with the potassium where we've got a downward trend. We still have lots of potassium. You know, 300 parts per million translates basically into 600, an estimate of 600 pounds available potassium. So we're still well within our comfort zone, but it is a trend that we've identified that we need to keep a closer eye on. So with this, like the rest of the stuff you see on the slide, here's our soil test levels for this year. Here's the group average. So a lot of the data that I'm showing you this afternoon is out of our benchmarking program. There's probably anywhere between 200 to 300 fields over a span of 5 to 6 or 4 or 5 years. It'll vary, but just to give you an idea, and all of these fields are within about a 20-25 mile radius of our home office. But when we look at this data now, we can say, okay, how do I compare against the group average? We see in here these box and whisker plots. The soil test levels are basically ranging from 5-6 pounds, well, as low as 3 pounds. This is the bottom 25%, this is the middle 50%, and this is the top 25%. So these are fields typically that have been manured that have a lot higher phosphate levels. But we can see that our normal range seems to be in that 5 to 15 ppm. So this gives us a gauge to say, are we in the norm, or are we out of the norm? Is it something that we need to look at to address? When we look at nutrient balance sheets, this is the next step forward. So because we're soil sampling every year, now we can start looking at it and saying, okay, how much fertilizer, or what's the ratio between, am I putting on enough fertilizer compared to what the crop is taking off? So when we look at this field, we talked about phosphate, you can see there's a lot of red here. If we dive into it, we can see that some of these fields we've had some great yields, which is part of the problem. Okay, we haven't, this field's an overachiever, we're getting higher yields than what we're targeting. But then we've also got 3 years of soybeans in here, which are probably what really hurts. We know that soybean doesn't really respond to applied fertilizer. So a lot of guys tend to skip out. They're putting in the soybeans with the planter, they don't have a fertilizer kit, so they don't want to make an extra pass on the field, so they tend to leave those years out. But what we end up with in this particular case, I showed this to the farmer and he said, oh boy, that probably helps explain what we're seeing here and this trending downwards. So we do have to make a corrective action there to try to make and build that back up. Okay, next we're going to talk about yield mapping. How many people here, or how many farmers yield map? Okay, half a dozen. How many have the capability to yield map but don't because it's so hard to get quality data, whether that's calibrating the combine or you have multiple machines in the same field? Is there anybody that will park the combines and make sure that the yield mapping is working at harvest time? Probably not, right? Part of that is because these things can be of limited value, but there are a lot that we can do with this. So this particular field is a field of fall rye in 2020. It averaged 95 bushels, so it's a great rye crop. But we'll notice, there's certain areas that were below 90 bushels and certain areas that were above 100. So the question now becomes, okay, these areas that are lower yielding, are they still profitable? Should we be farming them differently? Should we be treating them differently? So with the yield map, now we can start looking at profitability. So if I take that map and multiply the yield by 550 a bushel, which I think is the price and the cost of production right now for 2025, we'll see that there's areas that we're grossing under $400 an acre, other areas in the middle where we're kind of in that 500 range, and some areas we're 550 to 600. So I think just the operating costs alone on fall rye in the 2025 cost of production guide were about $380 or $400. So when you look at these zones here, there's probably areas that were break even or that we're actually losing money on. So that again, do we need to treat these areas different? When we take that same map, we can use it again to look at removal, and phosphate removal is something that I'm very interested in because we're trying to get a better grasp on our phosphates, because on paper where we have fields that have 3 parts per million phosphate, we really shouldn't be growing 50 to 60 bushel canola, but yet we do. So it's something that I'm really tuned and trying to figure out, so I'll pick on phosphate. But with that yield map, we can see that there's areas of the field that had, 30 to 40 pounds removal, other areas 40 to 55, or 45 to 55, or 40 to 45. When we look at the average removal is 40 pounds, and that's probably typically an average phosphate application on cereals in a lot of crops. 40 to 50. I would say a minimum 40, but what's interesting, okay, are these patterns repeatable? Because if they are repeatable, what happens is we are mining out these really good areas at a much higher rate if we're only applying. When you think of a crop like canola, it can vary quite a bit on a field. A 50 bushel canola crop could have 30 bushels on the low end, and as high as 75 or more in the better areas of the field. Canola is a crop that removes about 1 pound of phosphorus per bushel, so it's easy figuring. If we're only putting on, especially canola, which is hard to put all of your phosphate requirements with the seed, so we're often cutting back. If we're only putting on 30 to 40 pounds of phosphorus, but we're removing 75 to 80 in some of the better parts, we're mining it out twice as fast as we're replacing it. So how many years can we keep doing that before our good areas get depleted and the average across the whole field drops? But because we are on a floodplain, so I tried to put a little bit of topography into this. This field probably has about 6 feet difference in elevation. This is the low side of the field, but there are some draws in here and then some higher ground. Our variability in the Red River Valley, so these fields, we're probably sitting on 100 to 200 feet of clay. They're heavy clay soils. The water is slow to move through them, but a lot of our variability depends on what we get for rain, how serious of a rain event, and then what crop or what time of year and what stage the crop is at. And the rains can have an impact in a couple of ways. They can stress the plant out, but they can also cause a lot of fertilizer loss to denitrification or leaching. So in this particular field, I'm just going to zip through here, 2021, we can start stacking these nutrient removal maps. 2022, 2023, and then finally oats in 2024. So when we start stacking these maps, now we can look and say, okay, what is my total removal across all of these areas? So we do have some areas where we don't have that much, the average was 200 pounds over 5 years. We have some areas where we've only pulled out 180, so if we put on 200 pounds, we've maybe 20 or 30 pounds that we over-applied in those areas. But then there's other areas of the field where we're shy that much that we've mined that out. And I'm just going to back up one slide so we can look at all of the yield maps on the same page. The one thing that catches my eye is there are some similarities when we look at these. For instance, the 2022 corn matches the fall rye quite well. The sunflowers match the dry beans quite well. The oats don't really, they're a combination of all of the above, it seems. So when we look at this map, now we have to ask ourselves a question. Does it pay to variable rate apply these fields every year? Hard to say. That's where we see the biggest differences. If I stack them all together, my difference, I might be taking 30 pounds out of one end, putting it somewhere else. Is my better strategy to do a corrective action every so many years? On a corn year where we apply all the fertilizer in the fall, generally it's applied with an air drill or a floater. There we have the opportunity to variable rate apply phosphate. Does it pay to do that? Or maybe the best strategy is just to add an extra 5 pounds every year and make sure that we're meeting the removal in the best growing areas of the field. So again, just to reiterate, a lot of times, especially something like phosphorus, we want to look at what is the removal across the rotation. We add that up and then we figure out what our average removal is, and that's at least what we want to try and put back into the ground. Following so far? To switch gears now, again on the topics of variability, field variability, and trying to find out what the problem is, how can we address it. The province has LiDAR imagery for most agricultural areas of Manitoba. It's free to download. Usually it comes in big watersheds. There are free software packages that we can use to kind of tease out the field that we want and then have this 3D map or of elevation. So we can start to look at it and say, okay, how's the lie of the land? How does that translate into what I know of the field? With this data, the next step, what we can do is we can start teasing out different areas of the field. So the first step that I like to do, because we're in a floodplain and because we're dealing with lots of rain and heavy clay soils, is tease out where are my depressions. And this takes the elevation data that we have and it turns it into topography data. So now we can look at it and we can say, where are my depression areas that would typically hold back water? You'll notice on this map here that we have a lot of the low-lying areas, but we've also got depression areas on top on the higher ground. Maybe not so much on the ridge, there might be one little spot there. But you can see depression areas that hold back water can easily be on the higher ground as much as it is on the lower ground. And conversely to the areas that hold water, we can also tease out where the areas that shed water. So these areas tend to be thinner in topsoil, because when I mentioned how our soils were formed over the last 5,000 to 10,000 years, these higher ridge areas have always shed water. There's less water available for plant growth, so you have less organic matter, less biomass going back into the soil. There's less water. These soils tend to be less, or the soil profile tends to be less developed because there's no infiltration in those areas. All the water tends to pond in the depression areas, and that's where it's used to sit all summer or all season long and slowly percolate into the soil, bringing down organic matter, bringing down nutrients. So these areas here are already thin. They're at high risk of erosion, and that's where I talked about man-made influences. Since we've been farming the last 100 years, you don't see it as much these days with the advent of minimum till and zero till, but back in the day when we used to summer fallow a lot, these areas might have only started with 12 inches of topsoil and now they're down to 3 or 4 or less. So with those data, then we can start looking at zones in the field. Are there areas of the field that react the same? This can help us. For me, it's been a game changer. It helps me in my scouting. It helps me explain some of the patterns that we see in the field. But it's also stuff that we can look. Now we can start, okay, what makes the ridges different, or what do they have in common? What do the low depression areas have in common, and what do they have in between? We can delineate management zones with this that we can use for variable rate seed applications. Often cutting back plants on the ridges where there's less water available and putting more plant population in the depression areas where we have more water will help even out a field, even out the maturity. It helps carry those plants. The less plants we have, the more water there is available per plant to carry it through to maturity. But this just tells us the surface. This doesn't dive in a whole lot. Like, yeah, we can do zone-based soil sampling to figure out, what's going into what's happening nutrient-wise in the soil profile, but that's where we can add another layer, like electrical conductivity. So electrical conductivity, we're measuring the water content, or basically how much the electricity will pass through two electrodes in the soil. So it measures the water content and also some of the salinity. So this is one of the best approaches I've seen to managing or making zone delineations, because you're looking at it from a topography. It's water-driven yield potential. That's probably the best term. We can use it to direct field scouting. We can use it for, do we look at top dressing? For us in our area, not only do we look at top dressing in season if we think we've had a lot of nitrogen loss, but once we're in season, that's when we know what kind of season we're going to get. And we have a better idea kind of mid-June. Did we have a good start? Are the ditches and the low-lying areas all drowned out? Usually if we have too much rain, those areas are drowned out, but the ridges get enough water to carry a crop, so all of our yield comes off of our ridges, whereas the inverse, on a drier year, the ridges tend to burn up, but the bottoms and the depression areas that hold more water, that are heavier clay, those are the ones that we see that we see the yield coming out of. So I didn't think when I started playing with variable rate that was going to be such a drastic switch from one year to the next, but we definitely saw that this year. There's a lot of areas we thought we were going to tend to be in a drier bias, so we were conservative with our fertilizer applications, but come into spring it started raining and then it didn't quit. Now this fall we have a lot of soil tests that are coming back with less than 10 parts per million, or less than 10 pounds of nitrogen in them. So we had some monster cereal crops that basically, when the soil test comes back that low, I can pretty much bank that there's areas of the field that we lost yield on because we didn't have adequate fertility. There's other sources of cheap data that we can use to make decisions on the farm. So we mentioned LIDAR or RTK. This is my home section where I grew up. There are some ridges of yellow clay running through there. There's a bit higher elevation here, depression area over here, and then another ridge or two here. This is Red River Emerson transition. This is probably Osborne clay down in the middle. But a cheap source of information is NDVI imagery, which measures biomass, so the thickness of the canopy, the greenness of the leaves. You can, it's readily accessible through a lot of sources. The source that we tend to use is Sentinel imagery, which is 20 meter resolution or 10. It's available. We'll usually get an image or two per season that we can use because there's always cloud cover and other things, but there's other sources of imagery that can take pictures daily if you want. But these are readily available, and you can see that it shows a lot of the same patterns as we're seeing on our elevation. We've got higher ground, lighter soils, the heavier clays. A lot of it is very similar. Another source of information that I find really interesting is the Manitoba Air Photo Library. So this is with Manitoba Conservation. You can go to the Air Photo Library, and that's where they have all of the aerial photos that were taken, often going back to the 1940s. So sometimes it's interesting to see, and it can help explain a lot of the patterns. It doesn't really correlate all that well on this field, but you can see oftentimes they used to farm it these ways for a reason. You'll see strange patterns in a field. And the other one here, which is kind of an interesting one, this was a fall application or a fall cultivation on the farm. It was with a wheel tractor, but essentially we're measuring the slippage. The GPS was measuring our speed. These red areas are 3.5 miles per hour, and these green areas are 5 miles per hour. So you can see as we were crossing over these ridges, we were picking up speed. When we're going through the bottoms, heavier clays, it was harder pulling. But it's uncanny. Like, I call this my poor man's soil texture map. You can see how there's a lot of similarities between these three pictures. It'd be no different looking at engine load on a combine. Another source of information on the farm is weather data. So there's a lot of weather stations that are very affordable now, hooked up to the internet, that deliver live information, and we can use that information in a variety of ways. This is a dashboard showing growing season information. We can figure out how much rain we got in a season, when it fell. We can look at how that impacts different yields or field by field, what the differences could be. We can look at, okay, what is the number of rain events over an inch that we've had? So we're worried about denitrification and losing fertilizer. Well, this can help indicate at the end of the season when we're looking back, okay, maybe we did have more loss than we thought when we're doing an audit after harvest. We can also use it for work planning. So this, what we're looking at on the screen, is a 7-day forecast, hourly forecast, and 0 are days that aren't good for spraying, 1 are marginal, and 2 are good for spraying. So you can see in this week, we have an afternoon or 2 that might be okay and have a spraying window where we have those optimal conditions. But what's neat too is that, in these cases, this is taking into a number of considerations, including rain, humidity. Not just is the wind blowing, but how much is it blowing, how variable it is, what the temperature is forecasted to be, and then the delta T. Delta T isn't very common. It's commonly used in Australia, not so much here, but it's basically how measure or a guess at how fast the water droplets would be evaporating on the surface of the leaf. Sometimes they evaporate too fast, and it doesn't allow your chemicals to get into the plant. We can also look at rainfall distributions when we're running a network. This was one of the benefits. So our growers in our weather network that signed on, some of them, this was all they wanted to see, was they wanted to see how much it rained and where. So for our group, we were starting to get a lot of growers asking about weather stations, looking for better data on the farm that they can use to plan their days better, but also use to explain what they're getting for results at the end of the season. So that's where we had the idea, okay, if one farmer, maybe they need 2 or 3 weather stations to cover their farming or their land base, what if we put a few neighbors together? Maybe we have 2 or 3 neighbors that together they would only need an extra weather station to cover everybody. So what it's allowed us to do as a company is we've basically created a weather network, but now we've spread the cost over multiple farms. So it's much more effective for our customers. And what we're seeing in this picture is that's about a 6-mile diameter, 3-mile radius. We're trying to put where we want to collect the most data. We're trying to put a weather station roughly every 6 miles so that every field would be within 3 miles of a weather station. But even then, some growers were asking for more data. They wanted to buy their own weather station or additional weather stations or rain buckets to get even higher concentration of data after that. So that brings us to the next question is, how good can we be? This is where we get into some of the fun stuff in the benchmarking. I mentioned a lot of the importance of early season start, how it's important to get the crop off to a good start. So what we've done, we've introduced these planter report cards for growers. These are on fields that we scout. We gave these to the growers after harvest when we sat down, and their eyes lit up. Like they were gung-ho, and they thought this was the greatest thing, because now they were leafing through all of their fields, seeing what their scores were, seeing how well they did. Now we did get a bunch of rain in the spring, so a lot of guys got A+ in terms of emergence and plant stand counts, etc., because we had the rains at the right place at the right time. But it's putting an emphasis again on the early season growth, especially a crop like wheat that sets its yield so early. We need to know this kind of stuff. It's very good to have at harvest, because we can use this to go back and say, okay, why are the results on this field different than on this field? These are great at harvest time. They do not replace boots on the ground, but it does force us to put boots on the ground and go take a look. So as farmers and even agronomists, I encourage you to give yourself a grade. And even if you're a farmer, you can ask your agronomist to grade your fields if you want a third opinion or a second opinion or a third-party independent biased opinion. They have eyes on quite a few other farms and can give you a better assessment. As a farmer, you see a lot of your own fields, but they have a lot more that they can compare against. When it comes to benchmarking, we've taken the approach we have to start somewhere. So we started looking at it, okay, we've looked at the field level, what the variability is and what we can do. Now let's look at it more of a farm level. and eventually we'll look at it as more as a regional level. So I mentioned the data in these examples. It's a sample set of about 200 or 300 fields. A lot of the information we're collecting is the same things that you guys would be submitting to crop insurance in your seeded acreage and your harvest reports. It's what are the seeding dates, seeding depth, row spacing, what kind of equipment are you using, what kind of fertilizer are you using, what's your placement, timing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you look at this is 2021, all the canola fields on one particular farm. Because we soil sample every year, we know what we started with for nitrogen, we know what we put on for fertilizer, and we know what we finished the season with. So that tells us how much nitrogen on paper made it up into the plant. And I say on paper because it's not really, we can't measure all of the denitrification, we can't measure mineralization all that well until after the fact. So I say on paper because these are all general rules of thumbs, and that's how we need to treat this. But we can see on this data that there is quite a bit of variability in the nitrogen use efficiency of the canola. So how many pounds of nitrogen did it take to grow a bushel of canola? We can see that the farm's average is about 3.5, but it ranges, from 4.3 to 2.2. What's really fun now is when you can start taking this information and you can start comparing it against your farm's long-term average. So this farmer's long-term average is just over 3 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of canola. This is a number that I would say I use quite often when I'm making my recommendations. That's what I'm targeting for fertilizer and soil test nitrogen. So those numbers seem to jive. But what the really fun stuff is we can start comparing, okay, what does it look like against the group average? So we have 3.17 is our group average. It's a little bit, so he's doing a little bit better. But then when you look at the top percent, 2.31. So these are the top 10%, the most efficient fields at using nitrogen, or high yielding fields are using nitrogen. That's the target. So when I talk about how good are we, how good can we be, here's how good we are, here's how good, that's our target, that's where we want to go. We can also look at top 10 yielding fields by crop. So now when I say learning the best from others, we can start looking at what their practices are. What varieties are they growing? What was their yields? How much nitrogen went into the plant? How much fertilizer did they use for nitrogen? I'm picking on nitrogen because it's one of the biggest expenses and one of the easiest to control where we get a response. Nitrogen, what forms of nitrogen are they using? How are they applying? When are they applying? What was their seeding dates, previous crops, so on, so on, so on. So we can start looking for trends. Are there things that these guys are doing different that I can implement on my farm? We can start uncovering other trends too when we're looking at, say, corn yield over a previous crop. I've got two graphs here, which are 2 different years. When we look at just 2023, we can see the orange bars are the number of fields and the blue bars are the yields. Usually it is frowned upon to grow corn on canola ground. Canola does not use the mycorrhizae that helps make phosphate available, so the mycorrhizae numbers tend to crash after canola. So it's not recommended to use high phosphate or to grow a high phosphate loving crop following canola. But when we actually look at the data for us, this 1 year, that's one of our best yielding fields. Sure, dry beans are better, and this one field of fall rye is better, but these aren't very big numbers, so it's, we got to take those with a grain of salt. But when we look at across the rest of the crops, we see a lot of corn on wheat, corn on soybeans. Corn on canola gives us our best yield. It did in 2023, but then we look at the long-term average, same thing, it's still one of our highest yielding crops. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that our phosphate is still adequate to grow a good corn crop, but it tells us also that, maybe following canola there's less residue, the soil warms up quicker, the corn gets off to a great start, or more, as the soils warm up, more phosphate is made available. So obviously it does work to grow corn after canola. When you look at something like soybeans, I've said before, soybeans don't really respond well to phosphate applications the year of. So in this particular field, they like soil test, or higher soil phosphorus testing soils. Nope, that didn't work either. You get the picture. So on this particular field, you can see 0 to 10 ppm of phos, and then 10 to 20. There's about a 5 bushel difference, and then it carries on after that. So we can expect an extra 5 bushels of soybeans growing them on soils that are 10 ppm or better. So that's maybe a target for where we want to try to bring our soil test phosphorus levels to. When you look at it in terms of phosphate fertilizer, I mentioned usually we don't see a response to phosphate fertilizer. On this particular case, we do see a response when we've got 20 pounds, but we don't when we apply 40 to 50. Why would that be? Is it because 40 to 50 is too much? Or is it because these were probably broadcast applied in the fall or in the spring ahead of the soybeans, but this 20 pounds was in the seed row? It was more available. 5 minutes? Okay. So comparing again against other farms, seeding dates is another one. We can see wheat yield by seeding dates. There's a big difference here. As we get in later on into the season, we have that downward trend. It doesn't always happen that way. Week 1 here appears to have been maybe it was too early. Maybe there's something else going on. Maybe 2023 was a dry year. I think these fields were probably in an area that got less rain than everybody else. So we had less yield, but it's not necessarily correlated to the seeding date. It's probably more correlated to rainfall, and that's something that we would have to dive in the rest of our data. Just another graph kind of that's fun. This is looking at growing degree day models for crop stage. Oops. Excuse me. When we're looking at the 1st of May, it's estimating we're taking 89 days to maturity, and then the average daytime highs during flowering for this case here, which would be early to late flower, was 29 degrees. When you look at June 1st, that compresses our window to 76 days. So the crop is in more of a hurry. It's more of a rush to finish. When we look at the daytime highs, it's lower. So it just happened it was cooler times at that point. But when we look at the number of days, I think this one was 8 days, and this one spent 7 days flowering, if these models are correct. But with these models now, as we can use our scouting data to come and justify these models and continuously tweak these models so that we can just keep dialing them in year after year after year. So we've talked about the first two. How good are we? How good can we be? The last one on my list is how do we get there? This year I celebrated 25 years on a volunteer fire department, and probably 20 years of those have been as captain and deputy fire chief. And some of the best advice that I got early in my career was some of the best chiefs, when they roll onto a fire scene, they get out of the truck, they put their foot up on the bumper, and they light a cigarette. So this is counterintuitive. When you're in an emergency, there's a house burning, there's somebody that's in a critical state that needs to be rescued. But the reason that step is so important, it's important on a fire scene to stop, take a look at everything from a 1,000-foot view. You want to look at it and say, okay, what am I dealing with? What are the possibilities? What are the ramifications, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the same thing in this case. We're looking at it from a 10,000-foot view, and then we're dialing it in. So we were talking about, regionally, and then dialing it in down to the field level. So how do we get there? We talked at length about agronomy benchmarking, yield by previous crop. Trying to uncover those macro trends. What should we be doing? What should we stop doing? And then using the power of peer groups. Together we learn faster. The next question, and how do we get there, that I would suggest, or the next step, is to do your own on-farm research. It's never been easier to do on-farm research. Everybody, or almost everybody, has a scale on the grain cart, or they have yield mapping in the combine. So there's lots of resources available on running your own trials. There's a lot of peer groups out there. All of the major commodity groups have their own on-farm networks. They're there to help you, and there's a lot of the growers we find are hesitant to join an on-farm research group, but then they realize, once they get into it, they realize it's really not that painful. And the thing that these peer groups do is they hold you accountable. In my career, in my farming lifetime, I've had all the best intentions starting trials, but then harvest comes in and we say, oh shit, it's busy, it's going to rain, let's just get it off the field, and then we don't take anything to harvest. And it's a major complaint of a lot of the the input companies that give farmers free products for trials. It's getting that harvest data. But when we look at this, here's a perfect example where we saw a trend in our benchmarking data, but then we've backed it up with our on-farm research data showing, it's fun when you can tease these out and they show the same results. So here's a seeding rate trial, fertilizer and soybeans. Basically it's a statistical significance showing that 20 pounds of fertilizer in the seed row gives us 2 to 3 extra bushels. When it comes to addressing field variability, when we started VR, we thought we could make our poor areas more productive. This all comes down to trying to figure out what is the difference? What is causing that field variability? Sometimes it's an easy fix, like drainage, or other times it's harder. It's something like salinity or adjusting pH. I heard a presentation yesterday where they said it was easy to adjust pH. You just, however many points you want to move it, you add 15 pounds of sulfur. It doesn't work that way. Not in our heavy clay soils. That pH is very hard to change. But it's all of these other layers. It's the yield data helps us quantify how big the problem is, and it helps us decide, does it make economic sense to go after and try to fix it? Are there other things, or these other layers help us uncover other potential fixes? But it's by knowing our numbers that we can manage them better. We're looking for what are those most yield limiting factors that we can fix that are under our control. The NDVI imagery I mentioned, combined with historical data, this was a picture that if you ask the farmer, he would be sitting across the kitchen table and he said, I've always farmed this field as a half section. That's not my field. My field is even tabletop, even corner to corner. When you look at the satellite imagery or the aerial photography from the 1950s, it tells a different tale. You can see that these pieces, you can see fence lines, field borders, et cetera, et cetera. So when you look at that picture again, this area here, this paddock is a lot poorer. This one, the whole south end looks bad. This one up here looks bad. The farmer didn't know that or didn't realize that because you don't see it when you're driving by in the pickup. But oftentimes grandpa or even dad can come in and they'll pick these maps apart. They love looking at these. They'll say, oh yeah, this used to be a field, this used to be a field, there's a fence line here. This part we bought from the neighbor and whatever, it blew really bad and back in 1930, whatever. So there's a lot of different sources to the data that we can try to find what are the causes of variability and what we can do. So to wrap up, 3 questions that lead to better decisions. How good are we? How good can we be? How to get there? Boots on the ground does not replace all of these maps that I'm giving you or all of these different tools that I'm giving you. The whole idea is to get better clarity, to understand what's happening in the fields. At the end of the day, I like to say we fail faster by trying. Failing is learning. Just make sure you start small. You don't want to adopt a practice widespread and have it cause major problems. Knowing their numbers, having the confidence in your decision will help make farming fun again. Thank you.